Hey, and welcome to another episode of Next of Kin. The world is a scary place at the moment. We're watching wars break out in real time, violence against women every day, and senseless tragedies that leave us scratching our head that we find really hard to understand. The world has never been short of trauma, but now we're not just experiencing it, we're watching it unfold on a 24-hour news cycle. So what is trauma? How does it manifest in us? And most importantly, what can we do about it? Today I'm speaking with Nikki Heyder. Her next of kin are her husband Raven and her son Bodhi, and they live in Bali, Indonesia. But she grew up in Perth, and that's where I got to know her. Even if you don't think you've ever experienced big T or little t trauma, which we'll go into in the episode, please listen, because I think you'll find that trauma can show up in all sorts of places and manifest in us in all sorts of ways. I loved this chat and I adore Nikki, and I think you will too. Here's Nikki. Hello, Nick. How are you?
Hello, Case. I am good. And I am also coming off the back of feeling a little bit frazzled this morning because I woke up to my very big Labrador, who's just had an operation 5 days ago, jumping up on our fence to bark at the turtles and split his stitches open. So I woke up at 6 a.m., baby in arm, full of blood on the floor. And, that just freaks me out. And so dealing with that and feeling very overwhelmed, not a nice way to start my morning, but he is okay and he's at the vet. So.
Oh no, doggy dramas are the worst. It's a perfect segue for me. So thank you for lining that up for me because we are talking about wounds today. We're talking about trauma. And yes. I wanted to begin with you by sort of teasing out what trauma is and what it isn't, because on one hand, trauma seems like a very intense word, that for something to be traumatic, it has to be this big, huge event that completely rattles you and changes your world. And then also on the other hand, we have people using that term quite flippantly and interchangeably with other things. And also this sort of over-pathologizing or over-diagnosing of really normal, natural responses to things that are hard in our lives, turning everything into sort of a disorder of some kind. And you spend a lot of your time in trauma, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about it, because I feel like you have a front row seat to what it is, what it looks like, what it means, and how it plays out in your clients' lives and therefore potentially in the listeners' lives. Can you tell us what is trauma?
Yeah. What is trauma? So trauma, the word itself means a wound. I think in the traditional sense, it is a physical wound. If we're looking at it from a medical perspective, from a psychological perspective, we're looking at as, I look at it as more of an emotional wound, a wound that challenges and rattles our belief system, that challenges and rattles our ability to regulate ourselves in the present moment. So it affects our nervous system, our beliefs, and our ability to regulate and understand our emotions. Trauma, as you said yourself, it can be something that's really big and really significant. Some people use the term big T, little t trauma. So they can say something that is a big T trauma, maybe relating to something that is like complex trauma or chronic trauma. So incidences which happen repetitively over periods of time, chronic being the same thing happening over and over, complex being a variety of things happening simultaneously. So that can be something, we usually see big T trauma when we're looking at, say, relational trauma, developmental trauma in childhood, for example. But also big T trauma can be like being, a part of a war, like what's happening in the world at the moment on a collective level. Is also big T trauma. It's this ongoing chronic trauma that is happening, chronic stress happening every day that is impacting our beliefs, our nervous system, and our emotions. We can also have little t trauma, which may be, like you said, life's moments that feel really big in the moment, We have a reaction to it. We have an activation to it. We have an emotional response to it. So what comes to mind for me is like my dog passing like of 15 years, a few years back. That was a big, significant life event for me. It was a little T trauma for me. It was something that really impacted me in the moment and in the months to come, but it's not something that has influenced or changed my perception or my ability to cope now. So I would say that something's a big T trauma is probably something that lingers and affects us like well into our lives.
So, for example, I imagine big T trauma would come from situations of abuse or neglect or violence, things that completely change and shape who we are and our reactions to things well into the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Violence, abuse, neglect, poverty. There's intergenerational. So there's like things like racism, segregation, things like that can happen to communities and collectives over periods of time. That is hugely traumatic and a big T trauma because that shapes the way a person thinks about their place in society, for example, or their ability to have success in life, right? So these things really shape a person's view. If we look at something like the ACE study, right, that's an example of looking at what you were saying, neglect, violence, abuse within a household and how that affects people later on in their lives in adulthood. So that's the adverse childhood experiences study, for example.
And that looked at how adverse childhood experiences then affected people in adulthood. And I know I've got a little bit of familiarity with this study, and I know that not only does adverse childhood incidents make you more susceptible to mental illnesses like depression and substance use disorder, but also physical health. So,
yes,
increased rates of heart disease, significant obesity, those really, it's sort of that trauma really playing out in a very physical way.
Yes, through the accumulation of toxic stress and therefore inflammation in the body. So that kind of link between inflammation and disease is what we can see when we're looking at that study, which was, 17,000 people over a few years that they looked at. It's a big study. Since then, there have been expanded studies, like there's something called the Philadelphia ACE Project, and they actually added some more onto that. They looked at bullying, which was interesting and I think really important. They looked at neighborhood safety, so like how safe you feel within your neighborhood, community violence, racism was another one, and children growing up in foster care.
That's so interesting because I'm really glad that you raised bullying, because as you were talking about little T trauma, I was thinking about the fact that trauma is also very personal. Right. So, so Sally and Johnny can both be in year 3 and both be presenting their news to the class. And both of them are so nervous that they wet their pants. And for Johnny, he is a fairly robust kid. He shakes it off. It's a funny story that someone tells at his 21st and it makes him blush and that's okay. But for Sally, that's an experience that does cause in her a little T trauma, that fear in her or that trauma in her absolutely shapes her future. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes and no, in the sense that we'd have to look more than that. We'd have to look at what's happening in her life at home. What is her home environment like? Is there bullying present in the home? Is there bullying present within the siblings? What is her nervous system regulation like? Is she a highly sensitive child? Is she neurodivergent? What is her self-esteem like? What happens when she goes home and she says to mum or dad, this is what happened for me at school? Do they join in and laugh at her, or do they hold her and say to her, darling, that's okay. That happens when we're nervous. It's actually, a part of the bodily function of our stress response. What does that whole sequence of events look like? And also, who is she amongst her own internal world and what's happening for her? Trauma and how, whether it impacts us or doesn't impact us short-term or long-term, depends on so many different factors happening at once. And that is why it is so unique. And that is why someone's trauma will not be the same trauma for someone else, because all of those factors need to be taken into consideration. And this is why, like, I guess on a personal level, when I see things, online, like heal your trauma in 5 days, or like here's a 5-step model, or whatever it might be, it does irk me a little bit, because it's not taking into consideration the very unique, very individual experience of that person and everything else that comes with it.
It's a very complicated little ecosystem, isn't it? I want to talk about that
really
in the context of parenting, because my friends and I send each other so many parenting podcasts that focus on how do I not fuck these kids up, right? Yes. And the short answer is that we will. We will.
Yes.
But we are so much better at repair. And I don't think we know yet what the impact of that will be, because life has no shortage of traumatic situations, and it's the way that we kind of absorb them and then, I suppose, utilize them in the future, whether or not they find a home in us that fits okay, or whether or not they do become some kind of trigger or remain to be a trauma in us. I had a situation with my eldest, Miss M, we call her, where when I was caring for my dad, I knew that she was going a little bit wobbly. I knew that me being gone a lot was really hard for her. And I also knew that I wasn't willing to give up looking after Dad. So all I could do was assure her, this is not forever. This is just for now, and put every single safeguard in place that I possibly could, and now work on slowly repairing. I'm an overthinker. You've known me for almost 20 years. You know that about me. I overthink everything. But in that setting, it did allow me to try to be really considerate about what might she need and how might I repair this. What are your thoughts around how we are parenting, because you're a mum too, how we're parenting and how our commitment to repair might change the future of trauma for our kids?
Beautiful question. And also thank you for sharing that as well. I love hearing that. And I think there is so much healing in the repair process. A question that I ask a lot of my clients in therapy when they are sharing childhood memories with me or experiences that they've had that were hard. One of the most telling questions is, who did you speak to at the time? Who was there to support you? How did you navigate through that? The most common response that I get, like I would say 99% of the time, is no one. I spoke to no one and I had no one. And this means that this child is left to process what that situation means in their own way, in their own terms, with their limited objectivity and their limited awareness of the bigger world, their limited understanding of, in your case, like, why are we doing this? What does death mean? Like, why is mommy doing, like, that understanding on a level that we have as adults is not available to a child. And so when the repair is not there, the explanation, the reminders, the co-regulation with her when she's upset, when those things aren't present, she's left to come up with whatever belief she comes up with. Mommy doesn't love me anymore. I'm not as important to her anymore. There are other things, I'm not a priority, whatever it might be. And that could lead to self-identity beliefs about her, that she grows up and has these beliefs that she's not a priority. Other things are more important. She's not loved, whatever it might be. And I've seen and heard every different type of belief that can come from every different type of situation. So to answer your question, I think we, in our generation, with the awareness that we have, like, even though, yes, there is a lot of like pop psychology and insta therapy and like all of these things going on the positive side is that we are seeing an increase in self-awareness, an increase in other awareness, an increase in what trauma means, an increase in like what I need in order to regulate myself, an increase in like childhood development awareness. All of these things are giving us tools and an opportunity to shift things. Like mental health and talking about mental health is no longer a taboo topic. It is in some places, but for a lot of the world, it's no longer like that. It's no longer like it was for the generations before us. And so we are given this opportunity to maybe change patterns, or if we do have an intergenerational kind of history of trauma from our own parents and grandparents, etc., we're more able to be aware of like, okay, what's been passed down to me that I am conscious of and I don't want to pass down to my child, and how do I make that so? We have choice, we have awareness, and I think it's up to the individual to turn that into action. So we can either ignore all this information and do nothing, or we can take it and we can do something. And with doing something, we can create a ripple effect of change for our children. And that's not to say they won't. I hope all our children go to therapy. Like, I hope that they do. I want them to. I want Bodhi to see a therapist when he's older, you know? I want him to understand himself because it will make him a better person.
Fully. I subscribe to that wholeheartedly. Let's talk about how trauma plays out in people.
It really impacts us in 3 really specific ways. One being dysregulation of the nervous system, meaning that all nervous systems are designed to respond to stress. As we know it, technically speaking, it should be a short-term response unless the stress is obviously ongoing for a long period of time. But like the dysregulation of the nervous system response means that we're having bigger responses or overreactive responses to maybe things that don't require such a response. Our window of tolerance narrows, our ability to tolerate life becomes a lot more narrow, meaning that we are dysregulated a lot more frequently. To put it into everyday jargon, you're triggered more often, might be the way that you look at it. So that's a dysregulation. Then there is disempowerment. A lot of the time what we see in trauma is that a person's sense of agency is taken from them. So their sense of like, whether that be a child's connection to their intuition, whether it be agency of their physical body, if there's physical abuse or sexual abuse, whether it's a disempowerment through class structure, racism, hierarchy, or family dynamics of having like a power head in the family and then like repressing or suppressing a child or a person in the family. So when you're having the power play, so disempowerment, and then having disconnection. So something that happens as a result of trauma that we see a lot, for example, can be like a numbness in the body, dissociation, disconnection to ourselves, like indecisiveness, not knowing who we are, disconnection from the world around us, disconnection within relationships. So there's just a feeling of like, I'm not connected to myself or others or the world. I'm kind of doing that as a means to cope because at the time being present with what was happening around me was too painful to deal with.
For anybody who's listening to this going, that sounds like me, does that mean that there is unearthed trauma there? Or do those things overlap with other, like I'm thinking about somebody who's sitting there listening going like, God, that sounds like me. What should they do with that?
I mean, I would say that when we're looking at healing those things, we're trying to embody the opposite. So we're trying to forge connection to ourselves and others. We're trying to find our sense of authenticity, power, intuition, trust, self-trust, you know, and we're trying to learn how to self-regulate, to self-soothe, to find our ability to increase our resiliency. And so if anyone listening is resonating with this, then great. You know, that's wonderful self-awareness. And also it's an opportunity for deeper self-inquiry, and it's an opportunity to find a greater amount of peace in your life through exploring any of these these 3 different means with someone who is trained and qualified to help you navigate through them.
Let's talk about that because like you said, with so much pop psychology, this Insta therapy, everybody's an armchair expert. Yeah. We're all cracking jokes about being triggered by not getting our coffee order right in the morning or, you know, hearing a song or whatever. Like there's so much of that online. And I really want people listening to this to understand why, if there is trauma there, it is particularly important that they work with someone who is trained to be able to hold space for and help them work through that. And that may be a clinical psychologist or a counsellor or a therapist, and it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to those people. It can be a particularly trauma-informed allied health professional. But I guess my concern, or a really trauma-informed friend who's a very safe space for them to be able to have a great conversation with them. But I'm mindful of the fact that the expansion of the conversation around mental well-being, I think, has meant that it is applied in any and all settings. And speaking to your personal trainer about trauma is, you know, I'm seeing online these somatic workouts where it's like all of your trauma and therefore all of your kilograms are located in your hips. So if you lay on the floor and roll side to side, it will all come out and you'll lose all of this weight. Like, I just think everything has been so almost commercialized to the point where it can be really unsafe. And you certify people in being trauma-informed space holders for people. So tell me why that's important.
Yeah, I run a certification for trauma-informed coaches and space holders who are oftentimes certified in other things as well. So I've had psychologists, social workers, breathwork facilitators, kinesiologists, doctors, Chinese medicine practitioners, business coaches, and HR managers. Like, all sorts of people come through this certification. The reason why I created it is for the very reasons that you're speaking to, is that I believe that there is a space for everybody to play a part in a person's healing within their scope of practice. And within that scope of practice, how do they do that safely? And how do they do it with this awareness that we've spoken about of the very complex, individual, unique experience of each person? Like, being trauma informed means that we are able to not only be ethical in the way that we show up, to work within our scope of practice, which is what we are trained to do, but also to understand the various ways that trauma presents itself, the various symptoms in which it arises, the patterns, the behaviors, the thoughts, the influences of society, the microaggressions that could impact people. Like, you're really being able to see a person and then see everything that comes off that person and attune yourself accordingly, because the whole point of being trauma informed is to reduce the risk of re-traumatization. It's how do we recognize that each person in front of us is an individual with an individual experience, and then how do we recognize how we show up within that space? So the personal trainer, to be able to practice attunement, to be able to practice empathy, compassion, and also know that, hang on, I'm not qualified beyond this point to talk about this. And so what's really trauma informed of me is to recommend you to my psychologist or to my therapist to delve into this deeper. That's me practicing safe care of my client.
If anybody is working with someone, no matter what sort of expert or what sort of clinician or support person they are, if it doesn't feel safe and it doesn't feel right, you have to trust your intuition on that as the receiver.
Yes.
You have to feel like safe and held so that you avoid that risk of re-traumatization. In the last few years, a lot of things have, I suppose, kind of come to light for me, and really recognizing my own traumas and also some self-imposed traumas that across the course of my lifetime that I haven't taken as good a care of myself as I could have and should have. And I'm fairly self-compassionate about it. I was doing the best that I could with what I had at the time. But what it has translated to for me is that an incredible inability to make decisions. Sometimes I feel totally paralyzed, especially in the context of my workload. But also, you know, I can be out and not be able to make really simple decisions like which way should I drive home. And I've tried really hard to get better at just make a decision. Just make any decision. It doesn't matter whether it's the right one or the wrong one, and to practice my decision-making ability on things that don't really matter. What would you say to someone who feels like they are struggling with their ability to be decisive?
I mean, what you're sharing as to like what you're practicing on yourself is absolutely something that I think is worth doing, because you're wanting to cultivate self-trust, right? You're learning how to trust yourself again, and to know that any decision that you make, you are a capable adult who can navigate whether or not you do that or go that way or go that way. It doesn't matter. Like, you can navigate it. You've been through it worse than that before. But it's like your intuition, your body needs the reminder or needs the evidence that it is okay. We can trust ourselves and we can get through this. What I would share on that, especially this like indecisiveness, is like, do I go this way or that way? What that shows up as, and this is a whole nother kind of maybe podcast in of itself, is if we're looking at Dr. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, which is a way that he looks at the nervous system, it sounds like a functional freeze response, which is where we're functioning in our lives, but internally we're frozen in this like, do I, don't I, fight, flight, what's the decision I make? And that's usually associated with indecisiveness. It's like, I don't know would be the affirmation of the freeze response. I don't know what to do. I'm like a deer in headlights and I don't know what the right choice is. Do I fight? Do I flight? Do I go here? Do I go there? What do I do? So it is associated with fear, and usually with the mind, like with the thinking brain, with us being able to say like, oh, I'm anxious or I'm worried. What if? Should I? Shouldn't I? There's lots of worry that's happening up here in that indecisiveness, which is not your intuition. Your intuition is very much something that is a felt sense in the body. It's like an inner knowing that is felt for some people in their stomach, for some people in their lower abdominal, for some people it's in their heart. But it's really this like feeling in the body that even if it's hard, I know it's the right thing for me. And so where we can get out of the head and out of the fear-based kind of thinking or the feeling of fear, and coming into the body to say like, what do I know to be true? What do I know to be right? What do I know to be the best decision for me right now? And listening to the body and what it says. And that's hard to do, especially if we have experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, or extensive trauma, whereby our coping mechanism is to disconnect from our bodies. So this is where, once again, safety is really important, and slow healing to forge a reconnection where the disconnection has happened.
Oh, it's so interesting, because we do try and think our way out of things, don't we? When in actual fact,
yes,
it's the overthinking that often trips us up, that we do need to go back to our body. Like, where do I feel this? Why do I feel this? Like, looking back to our body for those clues.
Then also, being able to recognize when we're making decisions based out of fear. So even those decisions will be emotionally charged. So we're using a different part of our brain than the part of our brain that is associated with logical, rational, higher self-thinking when our bodies are relaxed. So it's like the difference between using the subcortical regions of the brain versus the prefrontal cortex. And there's just such different places to make decisions from. If I'm making a decision from my amygdala or from my emotions, then it's like going to be associated with fear and anxiety. If I'm making it from a very calm place in my body, and therefore that cortex, that prefrontal cortex is working, I can be like, okay, let me what is a decision that is most in alignment with my values? What is a decision that is most in alignment with like me having logical, rational decision making here and impulse control? So it's also just knowing that the nervous system activates different parts of the brain depending on if it's in its parasympathetic state or if it's in its sympathetic state. And that's going to determine the type of choices and behaviors that we make in our lives.
Hence the reason that for overstimulated people, or people with trauma, or people who are kind of grappling, that using some of those tools that we hear about all the time, like meditation and mindfulness, is that why that kind of sinking into your nervous system to settle it as a practice to almost tone it in the way that you would with muscles at the gym, to get you sitting more in that. You want the parasympathetic, right? Is that the rest and digest?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And you use the word tone, which is when we're looking at polyvagal theory, the main nerve that is involved in parasympathetic activation is the vagus nerve. And when we're looking at working that nerve in order for it to, engage our parasympathetic, we call it toning the vagal nerve. So we're helping it to bring our system back into a space of balance, to be able to put on the vagal brake when we're feeling dysregulated and bring ourselves back into a space of calm, steady, rational, logical, I'm safe, I'm okay, and I can make decisions from this place.
Let's talk about what we do about that then, because I put on my Instagram, as I always do before I do an interview, I'm speaking to an expert in X. Let me know if you've got questions. And so many of the questions that came through for this were about, what do we do about it? You know, we're always looking for the fix, and I totally understand that. So let's talk about some of the practical, tactical things that we can do when we are feeling, as you say, triggered, or, you know, maybe disconnected from our bodies, or dysregulated in some way, with the caveat that so many people answer this question by talking about breathing. And I wholeheartedly understand that answer, and you know, that kind of connection to breath, and using your breath as that tool, as the go-between between mind and body is really, really powerful. But what else can people do to kind of anchor themselves in the here and now in order to be able to, I suppose, pacify or soothe and get themselves into a more regulated space?
So many things. They can do so many things. And, you know, I'm just going to say now that what I'm going to suggest is not going to be applicable to everybody. What I'm going to suggest now is not please, when you're listening to this, notice that know that your unique situation is unique, in the sense that some people will be, you know, in more of a sympathetic type activation. Some people will be in more of a freeze type state. Other people will be in more of a shutdown state, which we haven't really spoken about. And that's where we're kind of stuck in a state of numbness, but hopelessness. You know, it can often be associated with feelings of depression and wanting to isolate ourselves from the world, a lacking of joy. So the world is no longer joyful. Our body goes into almost like a state of preservation and conservation of energy. It's our most primal stress response, where we shut down or we faint in a way in order to self-protect. And that is also a trauma response, where we go from fight or flight is I can, freeze is I don't know, and shut down is I cannot. I'm overwhelmed, I am unable to cope, and now I'm going to enter into this space of complete shutdown. Depending on which nervous system activation or which kind of nervous system response we are mostly finding ourselves in, will determine what type of soothing or what type of regulation practice is going to work the best for you. Someone who's in shutdown actually needs to, according to something called the polyvagal ladder, someone who's in shutdown actually needs to remind their nervous system that they can, and then they can come down to parasympathetic. So someone who's completely shut down might find regulation in doing star jumps, you know, or by moving their body, going to a boxing class, screaming in a pillow, being able to find strength in their body. There's really simple exercises where you can stand up against a wall and come down to a squat and hold that position until you feel your legs kind of shaking, and then stand up and move off and feel the power and the blood flow in your body, as a reminder to the nervous system that it's not shut down. For example, once you're reminded of that, then you may be okay, I'm in fight or flight. How do I move into parasympathetic and find my sense of rest and digest and calm? So there's so many different things, and it is such an individual process, which comes back to finding practitioners that know, and or having a variety of maybe holistic practitioners, or adopting a holistic approach whereby your therapy crew all speak to each other and they support you collaboratively, which can be really amazing. Personally, I believe in both what we would call top-down and a bottom-up approach. So I believe in talk therapy. I really find benefit in it, and I've seen so much good come from it in better understanding ourselves, talking about our experiences. There's a lot of healing in storytelling. So I think understanding and having awareness of ourselves is a really beautiful thing. I'm a big advocate for compassion-focused therapy, compassion-focused coaching, compassion as just a concept. And so in that, helping ourselves to shift our inner dialogue, you mentioned it earlier, of being kinder to yourself. How do we respond to our humanness with kindness? How do we respond to our humanness and our messiness with compassion? And that can be cultivating a new voice in our head that is not the voice of fear or not the voice of our previous memories, but rather the voice of a compassionate, wiser version of us, the version of us that would console a best friend, and like activating him or her within ourselves. So that can be really powerful. Outside of breath work, there are so many things that we can do that when it comes to like, okay, I'm flighty or I'm not present, I'm anxious. How do I ground? Grounding comes from engaging with our senses. So like you said, the breath can be a really sure way to do that. Absolutely. But sometimes people don't remember to box breathe, or they don't remember the cyclical sighing sequence, or they don't want to do it on the bus in front of a lot of people, for example. They might find that confronting. So there are different ways that we can engage with our senses, remembering that your senses are also to do with your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your sense of taste. So we can help the brain to create association with safety through those sensory things. So it could be, some people have sensory objects on them, such as they may have like a spinning rings are like a sensory thing. So it may be that you're feeling a certain way and you spin your spinning ring, and that helps you to just anchor your mind back into the sensation and the feeling of doing so. You can help yourself to associate safety with a smell. So say at home you have a regular meditation practice, or you have something or a space in your house that is a safe space for you. And every time you're in that room, or every time you listen to that particular soundtrack, or every time you do that meditation, you have a particular smell that is burning in the room, whether that be a lavender or whether it be something else. You can take that with you out. And say you're having an experience, you're feeling dysregulated, maybe simply smelling that can have this reminder in the body of I associate this smell with a feeling of da-da-da-da-da. Same thing with sounds, listening to a certain type of music that evokes a sense of safety, and then knowing that you can always put that in when you're having feelings of anxiety. So a lot of people use this with travel anxiety when they're about to get on a plane, or maybe they're in a car and they have anxiety about driving because of a previous car accident or whatever it might be. There can be a certain soundtrack that they listen to, and that helps their nervous system to feel safe because it's associating it with times where they listen to it with safe practices.
What about just laying on the ground?
Yes. Laying on the ground is actually one of my favorite things to do. It is incredibly grounding. And absolutely, when we're thinking about connection and cultivating a feeling of reconnection, I think a really beautiful thing to connect back to is the earth and gravity, and this feeling of being held, being nurtured, being supported by something that is so great and so supportive, being the earth. And so grounding is the opposite of what happens when we are stuck in our head, stuck in our thoughts, when we're in a negative spiral, which is all up here. We're wanting to come back down to earth, and lying on the floor without your phone, without anything, and just take some mindfulness and awareness, but connecting with what does it feel like in my body to be held, recognizing that a lot of these feelings of being held, nurtured, supported, learning how to regulate are experiences that many people didn't have in childhood. So a big part of the process of healing trauma is in a way a reparenting process of giving ourselves the tools and techniques that ideally we should have been given as children.
I want to talk about some settings in which trauma may occur. And the first one is in any kind of health journey. So being given a diagnosis and then making your way through a system that may or may not be supporting you particularly well. How does trauma play out in terms of that setting in a healthcare journey?
I mean, it can play out in so many ways depending on the person's previous experiences. But I mean, a lot of healthcare practitioners are not trauma informed, unfortunately. And so it is the diagnoses without the recognition of the human experience and response to that diagnosis. So it's not validating how a person may feel when they hear that, how the family may feel, the feeling of a loss of control, a loss of power. So once again, that disempowerment that comes up of like, now I'm just like a victim to the system. I don't know what to do. I don't have choices. A big part of trauma-informed care is that informed consent, offering choice, offering decision. These are your options. What feels right for you? Do you want to discuss this with us? How does it feel to you? How does it feel to your family? Here's the ways that we can support your family, understanding their unique experiences in this, right? There are so many things that can be done to make the entire system feel held, supported, and understood. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen in that way in most cases.
And having had a front row seat to that with Dad for the last few years, I wouldn't say that it was a trauma for me, but it was incredibly distressing. Incredibly distressing
of course it was.
To watch. And I think about trauma a lot in terms of how intertwined it might be with loss, because we have a particular aversion to loss. I think uncertainty we can deal with, but we hate loss and grief. How are trauma and grief tangled? Can grief be a trauma, or can grief only be a trauma if the circumstances around the loss was traumatic?
It would depend on so many things. The attachment of the person to the individual that they're losing, their own processing of what loss means. Like, it's so interesting that you say that, because death and loss and grief, which are inevitable in the human experience, are things that are not spoken about, that are very much taboo, that people don't like. Of course, we don't want to talk about it because it is scary. We don't know what happens afterwards. Like, of course, there's a lot of unknowns. And also, it's one of the things we know for sure that happens. Mm-hmm. And so this like unknowing and avoidance of the topic feels really scary. And once again, brings up feelings of like out of control. What do I do now? Who am I without this person? So how that is traumatic, I think for everybody, it's extremely difficult. How it happens can be really traumatic or not. Like maybe for one person, a long illness and having time to process what that means, having time to process the loss, having moments together where you're really consciously accumulating special moments together, knowing that this is going to happen. Still incredibly difficult, but maybe a little bit more healing because there is a process there. Sudden loss or watching it happen. So watching something unfold before you, watching someone pass away in front of you, seeing that happen, that can be very, very traumatizing, especially in the sense of having flashbacks and all of the things of replaying a situation. There is so much within grief, so many emotions, so many stages. Grief is really an umbrella emotion of which there is so much that happens throughout that process. So I think who is there to support you during that time? Who do you have to speak to? Who is your support network? How ready were you for it? Like all of these types of questions would help us to understand a person's experience of that unsettling or uncomfortable situation.
What about the trauma of losing a relationship that was very important to you? So whether that's a romantic relationship that you've broken up with someone, whether that's someone in your family that you've had a falling out with and you're now estranged from, whether you have had a dear friend that for whatever reason that friendship didn't work out and so you're no longer in each other's lives, that can be incredibly heartbreaking. Can it be trauma?
It could feel traumatic if you've had traumatic attachment wounds growing up, which a lot of people have. So if there is wounds or trauma with attachment in childhood, and then that resurfaces in the loss or the change in the relationship dynamic in adulthood. So if that reminds the person of what happened when they were younger, then what we might see in that moment is that adult reliving their trauma through emotion, beliefs, regulation, because the loss of that person or the change of dynamic is once again this memory of the past that's coming up in the present moment. If that isn't there, then I think once again, this kind of comes under this umbrella of grief, whereby I think grief is in of itself, for many people, a lifelong journey. Whether to say it's traumatic, that depends on the individual, but the healing of grief requires a lot of compassion, a lot of self-forgiveness, a lot of other forgiveness, a lot of understanding of how you're going to move through those stages. I think in that, ensuring that you are supported by speaking to someone, by having a support network, not keeping it inside. I think a lot of trauma happens when we keep things inside, thinking about that quote by Dr. Gabor, it's like, it's not what happens to us, but it's what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. It's just this understanding of like, it's what we hold inside when we're not sharing it, we're not allowing ourselves to be supported through something. What happens to that? What happens to that emotion and that energy and the beliefs and stories we tell ourselves? How does that then impact us into the future?
So is it fair to say that something can be traumatic without necessarily being a trauma? And is it a fair analogy to say that something traumatic is akin to cutting your hand and that wound healing completely, no scar, completely gone, you would never know where it is, whereas a trauma would be that you've got that residual scar tissue, it's there, you can see it, you can feel it. Is that an appropriate way to think about it?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
So last one then, in terms of where people might experience this, and you've got some lived experience with this, so I'm really eager to get your take on it, is trauma around money.
Yeah.
Money is hard.
Money is hard. We need money to survive. Right? It is a fundamental need in our capitalist society. We need money in order to survive. It helps us to have our basic needs met. As a yoga teacher, we would look at, money as something that helps our root chakra to feel stable and secure, right? It's really this like sense of stability, security, safety, connection, groundedness. Like I have enough to help me survive, to help me get through this life. When that is rattled, when that is taken, when we're living in poverty, financial hardship, and we're struggling to make ends meet, that is a threat to our survival on a very nervous system kind of level. And then that in itself can bring up other feelings from our past in relation to unworthiness, incapability, self-doubt, self-criticism. All of this stuff can come up. So, I had a situation in my business 6 or 7 years ago now, whereby there was negligence from one of the big banks, basically providing me and my business with a large sum of money in the form of the wrong products. And basically it got me into a really, really, really bad situation whereby I couldn't catch up anymore. I couldn't repay and also my business to survive. So I ended up in a position of severe financial hardship where I had to close the business. I had to seek free financial counseling. I was struggling to make ends meet. I was living off a very small amount. I sought out the financial ombudsman to help me resolve the case, to find the support that I needed, who found the bank to be negligent. But that entire 2 years or whatever it was, my nervous system was so heightened because I felt so unsafe and so on edge and so insecure and so out of control. I thought I could trust the bank. I thought they were making a decision, and like I placed my trust in the people who are the experts, right? And I didn't know, I'm not a numbers person. So I was like, oh my God. And then everything was a mess. And then I felt really disempowered. And then I have emotional childhood trauma, emotional abuse and things like that, whereby my wounding, my beliefs from my childhood of like, I am stupid, I'm not good enough, I'm an idiot, I don't know what I'm doing. It became evidence for me to be like, what am I thinking? And that feeling, like I've only now started talking about that trauma of what happened with the bank like this year. Because for me to even voice it a couple of years ago was met with so much shame. And that shame in my body is a remembered shame that I had when I was a child. And it's taken a lot of work will this impact me in the future? I think with the work that I'm doing and how I'm working on it personally, no. But it is testament to how long it can take to heal something. It took me 6 years to even start talking about it, to even like start feeling confident around my ability to run a business again, even though it wasn't actually my fault. But the story I told myself was that it was. Because
of course.
That's the story I used to always tell myself.
Well, it's also a really important message for, so many people are looking for a side hustle, stepping into some kind of entrepreneurial journey. And if you aren't fiscally abundant already, which most of us aren't, you aren't in a position to be able to hire private legal advice, accounting advice. You're going off your gut, what you can find online, and then, as you said, placing your trust in people that should know what they're talking about. And I think it's actually a really, really wise lesson for people to hear who might be thinking of or in the early stages of an entrepreneurial journey, because you don't need to know everything, but you do need to have people that you really trust and multiple opinions on the same thing, guiding and advising you, particularly when it comes to structure and setup. And, I remember that time in your life, and it was really hard to watch you going through that, because you had worked so hard to build this business. You had all of the right elements to have made something really successful. And from the outside in, it was really successful. And yet I could see in you that there was this fragility to you. And you also had some other things going on in your life at around the same time. So it was hard to be able to place my finger on, was it that or was
Which
it
one
that?
It was.
Yeah. And I could tell that there was a lot of shame for you around the money side of things. And I just want to say that I'm so proud of you. I'm so unbelievably proud of how far you've come, and to have another crack at business as you are, which in a way that is so aligned with your values and who you are as a person. I think you should be really proud of the work that you're doing and what you've overcome to get here.
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate that so much. It means a lot to me to hear that, and to hear it from someone who really knows, or could even sense as a friend, the fragility, as you said, of what was happening, and this like egg beater, like trying to, keep myself afloat throughout those times. And there was obviously also the very toxic relationship that I was in, like this horrible toxic situation that I was in with my partner at the time. So much instability. And interestingly enough, the relationship I was in and the way I chose to run my business was based off my trauma from childhood and the beliefs I had told myself, one of them being that I can't ask for help. So one of my coping mechanisms from childhood is a coping mechanism of being hyper independent and putting on a facade like everything is fine, because my sensitivity was like often ridiculed, or it was like too much. And also I had this belief that like I needed to prove myself. And so in proving myself, there was no room to not know. There was no room to be stupid. I had to show that I was good and I knew. And in that, there was too much pride to ask for help. Definitely one of the biggest lessons I have ever had in my business is to know your strengths and to know what is not your thing, and to be super proud of that, and to know when to hand it off to someone else to support you. Same thing with relationship. I was in that relationship because I was still attracting people and working in a relationship in a way that was coming from that wounded part of me that had certain beliefs around relationship that were very much associated with people pleasing and allowing a partner to treat me in a certain way that was not the way that I deserved to be treated, that was not in alignment with my values and my worth. But, I think a big part of this human experience is that we learn, we fall forward and we learn, and how else are we to get to know ourselves unless we go through this journey and figure it out. But that was a hugely traumatic time. And I think anyone listening who does run their own business or who is in a position of financial hardship, ask for help, ask for it all the time, because it is the best thing that you can do. And if you're in a position of financial hardship, like really learning to tend to your nervous system and seek the support that is free. There is a lot of amazing free support. I was very grateful to have the free support that I had at the time because I couldn't afford anything else.
for anybody who's listening to this, one of the most powerful things that you can do is say to somebody who's a little bit further ahead of you on the journey, I don't know what I'm doing here. There's no shame in that. I have no qualms ringing someone up and going, I have no idea about this. Can you please point me in the right direction or connect? Do you know anybody who knows about this law or this business structure? I mean, you know, we have ChatGPT these days that you can plug in and be like, act as a business advisor and tell me about X. But there's nothing like lived human experience. So being able to call someone or reach out to someone, and 99% of the time, people are so willing to share their expertise with you because they've lived it. And that feels valuable to them to be able to help the community out in some way. So don't be scared of asking those questions.
And it feels good to help others, doesn't it? Like it feels good in your body to be like, yes, let me help you. Let me tell you what I did or whatever it is, because it's so nice to give someone that gift, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And if you don't have those connections, join a local Facebook group and start asking strangers. Often other people in business are so generous because they've been there, and what goes around comes around. Somebody else has helped them with something else, and you don't have to come from this incredibly well set up network in order to be able to get support.
No.
Can I ask you lastly to finish us off about this concept of post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic growth? Because in your experience, there's such a lot of growth there, which is so wonderful. Do we subscribe to this notion of post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic growth? Is that oversimplifying it? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, I think it's nice to simplify things. I think it helps us to understand them on simple terms. And yeah, I think there are always both sides of a coin. And this might be maybe more of the spiritual or philosophical side of me speaking, but there is the dark and the light, you know, there is the joy and the sadness, there is the yin and the yang. And I think with anything and everything, there is that duality that exists. And everything that we go through, we have an opportunity to learn and we have an opportunity to grow. So I think that comes down to a person's willingness, the support that they have, and the amount of awareness they have. But I believe in the potential of humanity because I've seen it in action, and I see it in action every single day. One of the most incredible times in my career, you know, since becoming a therapist was in my work in drug and alcohol rehab, where I was witnessing firsthand people checking in, people with, you know, heroin addiction, meth addiction, alcohol addiction, who were in positions, of like financial hardship, whose family had taken, you know, their kids had been taken away from them. They had been in and out of lockup, like all sorts of situations. Like it just goes on and on and on and on. Seeing where they were in their lives because of their trauma, because of their beliefs, because of those beliefs turning into actions, those actions turning into consequences, because of the self-soothing need that they got through drugs and alcohol, which is a way for them to soothe their nervous system or to fill a void, right? And where that led them and how society would view them as being like, you're done for, you know, like this kind of assumption that, okay, someone like this, like they've got no hope. To watch the transformation through the appropriate care and love and nurturance and awareness and holistic kind of like mind, body, soul, spirit, to see them leave, you know, 2-3 months later as a completely different, more authentic version of them. It blew my mind, to say the least. It's what gave me absolute faith in the work that I do. It's what gives me faith in humanity as a whole. And it's whenever I'm feeling any moments of doubt or any moments of like, is this even possible to like really help people to heal on a global level? Like I think to those people and I think, yes, it is. It is. It is. It's going to take time. It may not happen in my lifetime or in Bodhi's lifetime, but it will happen at some stage if we like continue to show up and we continue to meet ourselves with compassion and to be able to facilitate the growth, because I think trauma is an amazing opportunity for self-inquiry. Your triggers are amazing opportunities for self-inquiry, but it's what you choose to do with the information you get as to what makes the difference and what enables you to grow or to remain stuck.
Oh, I love it. Nick, thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for giving up so much of your time to share with me today, with us today. I'm very, very lucky to have had the chance to spend so much of my life with you, but also to get to witness you in this iteration of who you are. I think you're very special and I'm grateful to have been able to share you with my world.
Oh, it makes me want to cry. Thank you.
That was such an eye-opening and heart-opening chat. I love the work that Nikki does in the world. I hope that it held real value for you. If you loved this episode, please share it with somebody that you love. That would mean the world to me. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, the original home for these is Substack. So nextofkin.substack.com is a conversation about how we can take better care of ourselves and the people that we love most. And I would love to see you there. You can have a free membership, which gets you access to my fortnightly articles, all of the pod episodes, and for a small fee, you can be a paid subscriber that supports my work and allows me to reach more people in the work that I do. It's less than the price of a coffee a month, certainly less than the price of my decaf almond flat white a month. So if you have the means and this means something to you, I would love to see you there. Otherwise, I will see you in the next episode. I'm Casey Barros, and this is Next of Kin.
This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a medical or qualified professional.